Alright, me. It's kind of late in the middle of June, but I just finished reading Empty Bottles Full of Stories, which is a collaborative poetry collection. The first half is written by Robert M. Drake, and the second half is written by R.H. Sine. I'm not I'm not too familiar with R.H. to really know how to pronounce their name, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, Empty Bottles Full of Stories. Um, Certainly, this is another thing of like excerpts that I read last time that I think resonated a lot more with me when I was 18, 19 than where I am now, which is weird to think about because it's only been 4 or 5 years, right? But there's a lifetime that has been lived in between these two moments in time, right? This was the other book that I had brought along with me to college in terms of poetry books that I brought with me. Once again, I have the whole thing of where I'm a terrible, horrible book owner and I bend pages that were important to me at the time. But yeah. This collection is interesting, right? Because there's this cohesive element into it, which it revolves around these ideas of lost love in some way, and the struggles of love and acceptance and things like that, right? Which is a timeless concept that's never going to go away, right? So it's not like, oh, the subject matter is just bad, right? But what it is, right, is that the first part, you have Robert M. Drake. I should say for both of them, really, for both Drake and Sin, you have these poems that are much like Stravinsky, in which there's not like this profoundness to them, but they're very deeply personal, right? They are your poems, right? They're not, you don't have to sift through them to get things, right? They're just very, very deeply personal. And with Drake's poems, right, there's this kind of what feels like an underlying narrative that kind of coexists within the poems, that more or less looks at how love is a never-ending battle of accepting both yourself and others, and how it's a destructive process in a lot of ways, right? Because in order to have this romantic involvement with another, right, you have to give up bits of yourself to then accept bits of them, right? There's also this, constant thing about going back and forth between, being too empty or too full of things, right? That both the excess and the absence of feeling and emotion can be destructive, right? Just in different ways, right? And then that's like the thing that kind of constantly gets brought up, right? Is that duality of absence, but also joy and excess and things. Yeah, right. Drake then, like I said, right, is kind of constantly on this balance of like of love and the difficulties of love, and trying to find and express love in a way that makes sense to other people, right? and that's really like the first half of this, right? It's referred to as the curse, and then Sign's portion or Sin's portion is referred to as the gift, right? And I think that the second half of this collection is very much this traditional collection sort of piece, rather than the sort of narrative that exists in Drake's portion, right? We have this kind of constantly changing narrators, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of consistency throughout Sin's portion, which is disappointing, because there's a lot of really nice pieces here, but they just kind of all get muddled, right? And so, I'm not sure exactly what Sin was going for, right? But certainly it feels like more so that each poem is meant to be published individually rather than in one collective story piece, right? Yeah. And then the other portion of this that I really don't like, and I've hate being negative, because I think that literature is such a fun and interesting thing that there's always something to look at. But I do have to, because it really drove me insane, is that the end of Sin's poems, the last like 5 or so in this collection, are like this really like self-serving kind of poetry, that kind of reverses and goes back on all of the things that Sin's set up beforehand, right? Of where now I'm doing all this poetry for you, and I need you to accept me and love me, right? Because all I'm seeing is pain from your end, right? Which then it contradicts all these other things about how this person that Sin's been writing about is this beautiful and strong and individualistic, and doesn't need a lot of support, and so it's a kind of a weird thing, right? Part of Drake's poems also do the same thing, of where it kind of falls into the self-serving kind of deal, but yeah, right. And certainly I would argue that in a lot of the way that poetry is written, especially within the contemporary course of action, right, of the feelings generation that kind of exists, that's the way that my one of my professors described it, of where like it's all about personal narrative and the personal emotions that exist within stories, right? And certainly within that, of course, you're going to have self-serving poetry and self-serving literature and things like that. It's just really weird to read in a collection. But yeah, that's that. Yeah, in terms of Sin stuff, right? It's another one of these things in which like it does the same thing, of where it's not this like technical marvel of literature, but it is this deeply personal, and clearly there's just so much emotion behind the words, that it really is moving and powerful, right? But yeah, that is Empty Bottles Full of Stories by Drake and Sin.